You're listening to Grown and Growing with Sonia Hamlin. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here because I have a phenomenal episode coming up. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Nicole Farmer, and I'll tell you more about who she is and what kind of doctor she is in a moment. But I wanted to have two healthcare related podcast in February because I know around this time, mid to late February, if people have made a commitment to focusing on their health in the new year, if they've made that their New Year's resolution, sometimes around this time, they tend to fall off, right? You tend to kind of back off. Maybe you've fallen off the wagon. You've committed to going to the gym, but now you're not. I understand that, right? I go to the gym every day, Monday through Friday. And I experience when the gym is super crowded in January, you can't find your regular treadmill, you can't find your regular spots, all the weights are taken. And then around this time, you start to get your parking spot back. You start to get your favorite treadmill or your favorite spot to, do your stretching. It's all back because people have kind of fallen off the wagon. My last podcast with Coach Nitra, where we talked about sustainable weight loss and healthy nutrition. And this podcast I have coming up are focused on health. And I wanted to focus on health because we have lived in this body for 40 plus years by now, or almost, right? If you're a little younger. And the wear and tear of those 40 years are finally catching up to us. We are not spring chickens anymore. And what we've done in the past or how we've lived in the past is kind of catching up with us. And even if we've lived a fairly healthy life in the past, your body still goes through changes just by nature of growing older. So I wanted to have Dr. Farmer, who is a trained primary care physician, as well as a researcher, on the podcast to kind of talk about health. I wanted to have a primary care physician because they are supposed to be our first line of defense when it comes to health. We're supposed to go to our primary care physicians to connect us to specialists, to be the person we go to with all our healthcare questions. But I have never been able to establish a real relationship or a long-term relationship with a primary care physician. I'm not really sure why, or I have some ideas as to why. I have been with my gynecologist since my mid-20s, since before I had kids. She delivered my kids, who are now 11 and 12, and I still have that relationship with my gynecologist. I have not been able to find that same thing with a primary care physician. And in this episode, we talk a little bit about that, why it's so hard for people to establish relationships with a primary care physician. It's not just me. I think it's indicative of the way healthcare is set up. So we talk about all of that. We also talk about where women should be focused when we're thinking about our health in our mid-40s. Yes, we know about perimenopause and menopause. We know that's coming, but what else should we be looking out for? It's a great conversation, and we'll get into it right after I read Dr. Farmer's bio. Dr. Nicole Farmer is a physician scientist at the NIH Clinical Center, also known as the National Institutes of Health. She is the acting chief of the Dietary Behaviors and Biopsychosocial Health section within the Translational, Biobehavioral, and Health Disparities branch. Whew, that's a mouthful. In this intramural research position, Dr. Farmer is involved in both community-based and patient research, exploring the role of cooking in chronic disease prevention and psychosocial health. Prior to joining the NIH, she was a well-established primary care clinician and routinely engaged her patients in nutrition education through cooking classes. Dr. Farmer's research focus may be categorized into three major areas: psychosocial outcomes of health behaviors, role of cooking interventions on dietary behaviors and cardiovascular outcomes, and microbiome-related mechanisms of health disparities. Dr. Farmer is an alumnus of Howard University College of Medicine, received her internal medicine training from Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, and held a prior appointment at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. She completed her fellowship training in integrative medicine from the Center of Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona and Duke University of Integrative Medicine. In addition, Dr. Farmer was named a Harvard Macy Fellow in 2021 for her work in incorporating humanities into culinary medicine education and research. Dr. Farmer's work on cooking and mental health was featured by the NIH Intramural Research Program's podcast, Speaking of Science. So without further ado, let's get into this topic. Welcome, Dr. Farmer, to the podcast. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. And I introduced you as Dr. Nicole Farmer, but I'm going to call you Nicole throughout the podcast because you gave me permission to do that. So,
Totally fine.
But I want everybody to know you are a MD, and you have worked in primary care. In your past life, you were specialized in internal medicine, and then you kind of pivoted to research. And I want to talk about both sides of your experience. So I want to talk about that, your internal medicine experience and your experience as a primary care physician. And I also want to get in a little bit into research, just a little bit, because I think there's so many misconceptions about what medical research or research in health means. And I know there are a lot of, misconceptions, maybe some fears around research as it relates to, to Black people and, our history with that. And I don't, have to remind people, but it's like, you have the Tuskegee experiment, you have, the father of gynecology, experimenting on enslaved Africans and African women. You have Henrietta Lacks. There's so many examples in history and currently, where that kind of distrust or, fear of research is there for Black people, and especially Black people in this country. And you pivoted to work in research. So it is obviously important. Research is so important to what we do, or to how we live our lives and to medical advances. So I want to start there. I want to talk to you, start broad and talk about why, after working in primary care for many years, you decided to pivot and work in research, like right before COVID, right before it got real. You were like, okay, not because of COVID.
Not because of COVID, no.
But but before.
Yeah, so the reason for my transition was I had too many questions swirling in my head. And when I looked into the scientific and the clinical research literature, I couldn't find answers that resolved those questions. And so I just felt like a compulsion that, people would come to me with. The major question that people would come to me with when I was in practice was around like their diet and their lifestyle, and how, not so much the what, because the what was coming out like through the anti-inflammatory diet and the DASH diet recommendations. This is like 2010, 2013, but the how do I do it was what people came to me with. How do I make this behavior change? How do I make this shift? How do I get my families to make this change, because they're part of my community? And so it was those questions that really disturbed me when I went into the literature, that I couldn't find answers to help myself guide patients. So that's what made me go into research, really. And then the biggest question I would get is, Dr. Farmer, you tell me to eat this way and eat that way. I don't know how to cook. I haven't cooked since I was a child with my mother. Like, why do you expect me to do this? And so I started cooking demonstrations and classes with patients. And I would see people, like, their behavior would activate. Like, once they felt confident and they had self-efficacy and they had the social support group, then they started exercising, they started doing mindfulness. And I really wanted to understand, what are the behavior mechanisms that cause that? So that's why I got into research and decided to shift gears.
And you work for the National Institutes of Health. So, an organization, or I guess it's a government entity, really, that, that focuses on all types of research. So I think it's interesting. Why do you think that there isn't any research, or more? Why do you think there's not more focus on how to get people to eat healthily from the medical field? Like, there's a lot of research around medications. There's a lot of research, around, surgical procedures,
Yeah.
but not really going to the root of what people struggle with, which is how to identify and how to make, healthy foods.
Yeah, no, great question. I think that part of the reason why there's not an emphasis on this in the literature or in clinical research is that we are taught in this medical system to think of the role of medications as opposed to thinking of the role of self or thinking of the role of community. And so it's a big split between this very modern Western way of viewing health, which is very disease focused, versus looking at health in terms of wholeness and wellness and not just being the absence of disease. And when you view health from a whole perspective, then you know that you have to look not only at one tool, which can be medicine, which can be emergency services, but you have to look at a whole entire toolbox of what may be effective. And so I think because that perspective is not universally taught in medical school or even in nursing school, then we have where we have now, where when people come out of medical school and clinicians are trained, and we're the ones driving clinical research, we're driving it based upon what we have been taught.
And so you're saying that nutrition is not taught very in a deep way, in a broad, comprehensive way in medical school?
Not yet. We're making
Okay.
strides. So the AAMC is actually meeting next month to start to develop formal nutrition curriculum guidelines. And then there has been legislation that has been proposed in the House last year to actually tie nutrition education in medical school to funding in residency programs. I'm sorry, to tie nutrition education in residency programs to funding. So we are trying to really push the idea that nutrition is fundamental to medical education, but not only nutrition, learning how to talk to patients about counseling, lifestyle, behaviors, and identifying what is the how, what is the why for your patient is extremely important to get beneficial health outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. It's really shocking to me that it's 2023 and that connection is only being made now. So that's crazy to me. Another thing that I think people associate with research that may not be the case because you work at the National Institutes of Health, so you may not encounter this, is, how much does big pharma, how much does industry dollars, how much does that play into research and what the outcomes of those research show? Or not even the outcomes, but what they tout, right? Because they may do a research study on something and it's, against whatever, industry is pushing that thing, and maybe you don't hear about it and that thing is buried. But the research is there, but, why is it? So how much does industry in your field and in your work, does industry money come into play, or if it does at all?
I am luckily I'm protected from that because I do work for a government research institution. So the research that we get to do, part of why I get to do social behavioral research is because we are funded by our government funds. So like your tax dollars at work. But I do know through lots of colleagues that when you're not looking at government funding, the next level of funding is big pharma. And so if the question is coming from people that are making the medications, then, they're going to expect the outcomes to serve that. I can say that I have noticed in the last 2 years a shift where some pharmaceutical companies are actually expanding into health equity research, starting to think about the why, the behavioral why, in terms of funding. So I have seen a shift, but it's been very recent.
And I know with your research, I went to look at what it is that you're working on. So one aspect is the impact of diet for people who don't have access to a lot of, maybe they live in the food desert, or maybe they don't have the means to have healthy food. So you're researching that. You research sickle cell disease as well. But how should, you're obviously Black. Okay, you're obviously Black, and I just want to make sure, we live
100%.
in a world where people get to identify what
I
they want to
know,
identify
however
with.
you want. Yeah, 100%
So
legacy,
I want to
Southern
be
Black
clear,
American. Yeah.
yes, that you're Black. And so how should Black people specifically, start to think about research in their own lives, and how health research impacts them, and how should they start thinking about it? We talked about the negative history, and even some current you know some current biases in medical health. So how should we start to think about research?
Yeah, and this is very complicated. So I'll actually start with the negative, and I promise I'll build into the positive.
Okay.
But when you mention the Lax cells and Henrietta Lacks, when I was a pre-medical student in a laboratory, we would use HeLa cells, which is what the term is for Mrs. Lax's cells. And so I used to always ask, where do these come from? Like, I remember being like 19, where do these come from? And no one could tell me.
Right.
And then the story came out like a few years later, like these were cells that were taken without consent. And so that always stays with me. And it stays with a lot of researchers that I know and that I work with, because it's an added layer of responsibility that we have. It's like when we start a research study, we have to really think about, you are asking people to share a part of their body, to share a part of their time, to share their family's time possibly with you. And then those results are forever used. And the importance of and the responsibility we have about the results that we put out. How are they going to be heard by other people, even though we intended for them to not be heard in a racist light? So, I think that's how I at least frame or think about the work that I do before I set out to do the research study. And then in terms of what I tell patients and participants when I talk to them about my research or anyone's research, is that it's important to understand, read the consent, read the purpose of the study, read about the investigator, see what else they have published, see how they have put out results of participants that are Black or any other ethnic group or in general. Just read how they talk about their work, because it's important, because your work, what you contribute to the research, will be discussed that way. In terms of the importance of being included in clinical trials and research, it is extremely important for us to be a part of answering the questions for a few reasons. One is that because of discriminatory history, because of the experiences we have in everyday life, we tend to have more stress. We tend to have more adverse health outcomes. And having an avenue into research is a way to have exposure to advanced medication. In my research, we do advanced behavioral interventions for people. So there's some indirect benefit or direct benefit that you can get from participating. But also, when we look at genetic results or microbiome results, if they are only occurring in people that are one particular ethnic group, then we can never apply them broadly to everyone else. And so oftentimes when I talk to especially white researchers who are sampling just from white communities, they tell me that they have no inroads into Black communities, which I just feel like, are you making the inroad? Like,
right. Is it right? It's like any other industry. I can't find any Black teachers. I can't find any Black IT people. I can't find any Black, fill in the blank. Because
exactly.
And it's usually because of effort, not because they don't exist.
Exactly. Right? It's usually because of effort, not because they don't exist. And then I try to educate people, investigators, about the importance of working with community advisory boards, working with nonprofit organizations, having partners that can help you. When you do start to make the effort to recruit minority participants, is extremely important. We not only see this with African Americans, we see this with a lack of Asian Americans in clinical trials too, so that we can't make important even statements about health disparities among many ethnic lines among Asian Americans, because we just don't have the clinical trial participation.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense for a host of other reasons. But because I work in healthcare as my day job, you have a lot of access to. I work at an academic medical center, so I see the importance of how clinical research saves people's lives every day.
Yes, I
And
apologize. Hmm.
oh, it's okay.
Hmm.
And I know that, because of our physiology and our history that, we don't, that some things are different for us. And so it's so important that we take, take play, take what I'm trying to say, to participate in clinical trials as a whole, so that we can take advantage of these medical advances as they happen.
Hmm.
And it's, I can go on and on and on about, how, diseases that are really, like sickle cell, that are really, specific to Black people who, we don't have a lot of research around it, or the research funding is so slight
Limited.
because of, various reasons. But I just wanted to touch on research a little bit because I do think it's important, and I wanted people to understand that background and where you're coming from. So now we're just going to pivot to
Okay.
your primary care experience. So how long did you work in primary care?
Oh gosh, I was in 6 years, six or
Okay.
7 years before full-time transition into research.
And
And
why did you choose primary care?
oh, I love talking to people.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a medical student, I caught the bug for really learning about people's stories and hearing their experiences in life. And then just weaving it in my mind together, like, oh, okay, that happened to you when you were 10. Okay, I can now see a connection to, like why you're here with anxiety. And like making that connection with people was really important. And I felt like primary care was also a place where I could make an impact in terms of how people led their life.
Yeah, because primary care is seen as like the first line of defense when
Right.
anything is wrong with you. It's not the ED. Don't go to the ED, guys.
Don't go
Go
to
to
the
your
ED. Please call your
go to
primary
your
care.
primary care doctor
Yes.
if you have one, right?
Yes.
If you have a primary care doctor. So I want to talk a little bit. So when you saw patients in the primary care setting, did you mostly, what age range did you see? All age ranges? Did you only see 18 and up? Did you,
I
see
saw,
older people?
yeah, I saw 18 and up.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say my patient panel ranged like literally, I had a group of adolescents, I had a group of 20-year-olds, I had a group of parents, and then I definitely had a group of seniors that I just enjoyed taking
Mm-hmm.
care of and doing home visits with.
Awesome. So we are here representing the grown and growing crew. We represent the 40 over crew,
Yes, that's me
the
too.
40 and over crew. And I really wanted to talk about health in general, overall. In my last podcast, that last episode that was out last week, I talked to a nutritionist, and we talked about the importance of nutrition and weight loss, and why is it so hard for people over 40 to lose weight. We are in the middle of February. And if you set resolutions, I did not, but if you set resolutions, weight loss is probably one of them. And, around this time, people probably start to fall off, right? They're like,
Mhm.
oh, I fell off the wagon and I'm not quite sure how to get back on. And I wanted to have, that nutrition episode and this episode with you to really remind people to get back to focusing on whatever goal. If you set a health related goal for your in 2023, this is your reminder or your motivation to get back on it. But I wanted to talk about primary care, and specifically because I think that so much more than just weight loss. We have so many other things that we need to focus on as women entering middle age, becoming older. Our focus for health is a little bit more urgent. Our focus is, it has changed, right? We may,
Mhm.
see our health differently than we did when in our 20s and 30s, because we start to see changes in our body. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was primary care. Most women I know, a lot of women I know, including myself sometimes, had used their gynecologist as their
Mhm.
primary care. Do you feel like that's okay? And if not, why should we include a primary care physician in our, into our,
Yeah.
as one of our doctors?
Yeah. So as my gynecologist said to me when I asked her to be my primary care, what would you do? What would I do if you broke your arm and needed follow up? And I was like,
Right.
oh, that's a good point.
Right.
She said, I'm not coordinating that. And I'm like, oh, that's a good point. So I do think it's important for women, especially our age, to have a long-term relationship with your gynecologist. But for the point that my own gynecologist made, there are concerns that will affect us that are not just gynecological, that we need to have a relationship with a primary care doctor for.
Mm-hmm.
And so primary care medicine is really relationship medicine. It's the doctor that you can call, that remembers when you had your children, remembers when you were going through an episode in your job and you were highly stressed and not sleeping and you had to take that supplement. Like, that's the relationship that really serves us well, especially as we go through perimenopause and we start dealing with hormonal changes that affect our sleep, that increase our insulin resistance or our tendency to gain weight. We need that person that remembers us and understands us to be that like coach, that motivator, but also give us the medical knowledge and say, hey, you know what? It's been more than 3 months since we checked your fasting glucose. We haven't screened you for diabetes. We haven't looked at your lipids. So that's where I see the role of primary care coming in.
Well, that sounds amazing, actually. And I'm glad you mentioned the word relationship, because I feel like, we talked about the complicated relationship between, the medical field in general and Black people, but now I feel like in general, sometimes, or the perception is there that it's hard to connect with your doctor. So how do you feel like, maybe you feel like you're rushed or your doctor doesn't listen. How does one go about developing a really good relationship with their primary care doctor? Like the one you just described. I want that one.
You want that one?
Yeah, I want that relationship you just
I will
described.
tell you, I had the most patient patients because they would wait for me. Because I never wanted to rush anyone out of the office. I'm going to tell you, it's hard to find, especially amongst some of the more recent grads. It's hard to find doctors who feel empowered enough to say to administration, my patients come before the schedule. And that's really what you want, a doctor that says that. Because then that's how you actually form a relationship with people. I can't form a relationship. I could see you 100 times, but if I'm seeing you 100 times for 5 minutes, we're not going to have a relationship. It has to be the time that is needed for each encounter. And sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 30, sometimes it's 40. It depends. I think my advice to people and my advice to myself is how I do a lot of interviewing of doctors. I don't just go by the name in the hospital. Like, I will go and have a first time appointment, see the demeanor, see what your response is when I tell you I have this concern or that concern, or I had this experience. And if I don't like, I shop. I think that's extremely important. And then when you find the one that you do like, let them know. Let them know, okay, the fact that you took your time, the fact that you actually asked me that question, I appreciate that. And then so doctors are people. So when we get rewarded through good words, we actually continue that behavior.
Yeah, I feel like that's good advice, because I don't think people think that they can interview a doctor. I think the way, because insurance is involved, you kind of go to it used to be a book, but now it's a website, and you just kind of are looking for little context clues that this doctor is the right one for you. Either start with their race, I want a woman, I want a Black woman, I want a woman, somebody who can speak Spanish or, whatever language I speak. And then that's kind of all you got. And where did they go to school? I like that school, even though we don't know anything about these schools. That seemed like a good school. And then it's just like on to the race. And then because you do that, it's like, okay, but you have to think of it as a relationship, and you wouldn't do that with a date. Like, you go out on a date, you wouldn't do that with a therapist. Cause I know I've interviewed therapists, but I feel like it's more expected that you would do that. Like, a therapist will give you 15 minutes to we can have a 15-minute call and we can talk, or a half-hour call. I've never had a doctor
a doctor won't do that. So you go, I'm gonna tell you this. So you go, it's like a new patient visit.
Okay.
Nothing in your insurance contract says you must return. Like,
Yeah. You know what?
just don't let it be a history and physical. So a lot of insurance companies will say you can only have like one history and physical a year, a calendar year. So when you have that next new patient visit, just can't be a history and physical. You're there to establish care. These are like the little code words that allow you to do that shopping.
You know what? And my test is, because I don't, I've been lucky not to have a lot of medical issues. My test is, and so far nobody has passed it with primary care, is if I go in for that annual visit and y'all don't tell me it's time for another annual visit, like I don't hear from you again, and I look up and it's been 2 years since my appointment. And I'm like, why? Just remind me. Tell me that you miss me. I know it's a machine. I know it's an algorithm. I get it. That automatically sends it out, but it makes me feel like you care. And when I don't get that letter, I forget. But you know who does that all the time? My mammogram people.
Exactly. No, they do.
They remind me every time, like, it's time to come back.
Right.
It's time.
And when they don't hear from you, they keep reminding you. Yeah.
They do. Yeah. They do, which I appreciate. I just want that from my primary care. And I do know, just from my experience, that primary care doctors are the busiest. Yeah. Like, it's hard to get them to do things, to get them to, oh, we want you to speak at this event, or we want you to do this webinar. Because they're so busy, because they have so many patients that they have to see. So I get it, but also, I think there are mechanisms in place that can make people feel like you want them to come back, even if it's not you personally, Dr. Farmer, sending me a note.
No, I completely agree. And I think using nurses on the teams and medical assistants to like do that outreach, because we do get so busy with seeing patients, is extremely important. Like those touch points, it's relationship building.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a little bit earlier, menopause. To me, like, seriously, every time I talk to one of my friends, it comes up. Am I in it? Am I not? So we know menopause is coming. Like, look, if you over 40, it's coming. You cannot run from it. But what else besides menopause should we be focused on as we enter into middle agers? We, get settled into middle age. What should we be focused on? I know menopause, you mentioned diabetes. What else should we be focused on as it relates to our health?
So we should really be focused on heart disease too, and blood pressure monitoring. So by the time we reach 40, most Americans, by the time they reach their fourth decade, already have some amount of heart disease that's present. It's not enough to cause a heart attack or to cause heart failure, but you have some degree present. Most of us are very responsive to stress. Stress will increase our blood pressure. Not to mention, we've had 4 decades, especially if we've eaten an American diet, 4 decades of high sodium, high additive latent foods that also increase our risk for heart disease and diabetes. So it is extremely important to get screened at least once a year to get those numbers screened. If you can't get into a primary care doctor, this is when using your gynecologist and getting your blood pressure checked there, or asking if you can have blood work done there can be important. Going to health fairs, checking your blood pressure and your heart rate at a CVS or a pharmacy. All of those things are important to make sure that you do. And then I think especially for African Americans, we, as a collective group, despite different ancestries, we oftentimes in the statistics have higher mortality from heart disease. Even though we may not have the highest numbers. And so I can't help but to think that that's because we're just not aware, or we become aware too late. And so the importance of just, not being afraid to just know, like, okay, my blood pressure is high. Like, this may be what I have to talk to my doctor about, like, and not shying away from it.
So is blood pressure one of those things where it is your normal is individual to you? Like, I'm kind of comparing it to like a BMI. Like, I know BMI used to be the thing. I don't know if it still is. I feel like it shouldn't be, because I feel like I will never reach where I'm supposed to be. Like, that weight is like,
it is shifting, and we have other ways that BMI is a model of obesity, but we have other things that we can do to think about, like, do you have too much representative fat for your body size,
Right.
besides BMI.
Thank you. I knew BMI was a it was a trap. But with blood pressure, is it that you want to keep what is the standard blood pressure, or is it different for every person?
No, so there's a
Okay.
standard that's based upon the population as a whole risk for heart disease. So
Okay.
the top number has to be less than 120, the bottom number less than 80. And those
Okay.
two numbers represent the ability of your heart to relax against all the pressure that is getting from your blood vessels, to relax and then contract and actually pump effectively.
Okay. I do want to talk about, thank you for that. I do want to talk about heart disease. I know you're not a cardiologist, but I do want to talk about heart disease as it relates to women, because I do know that heart attack symptoms for women are different than men.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do want women specifically to understand that, could you tell it? I know you're not a cardiologist, but can you tell us,
Yeah.
how those symptoms are different and what women should be looking out for when it comes to like heart attacks?
Yeah, so women should first and foremost don't discount the chest pain that you feel, that occasional chest pain. And if that chest pain occurs when you realize that you've just walked up a flight of stairs or you've gotten upset about something, don't discount that. But then there are what we call atypical symptoms that occur in women. So this can be anything from nausea, feeling lightheaded, or what we call like malaise, like just feeling like like you have the blah feeling, to jaw pain, to
You said jaw, like in your
jaw.
jaw?
Mhm.
Wow. Okay.
To jaw pain, which is actually the nervous system around the heart is connected to the jaw, so it's called referred pain. So if you feel like short of breath and you're stressed and there's like jaw pain happening, that can be a reason to get evaluated by your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And then also reflux symptoms.
Really?
Yeah, so I've had patients that I've diagnosed in the hospital that would have reflux symptoms along with shortness of breath and feeling tired. And then we did an EKG and did blood work, and then sure enough, they were having a heart attack. So, and these were women.
Wow. And I think, I mean, the hard part about those things is that you could just feel like that in general. You could have a toothache and it'll make your jaw hurt. So that's the scary part, but that's why why it's important to have a primary care doctor,
I was going to say that.
have a primary care doctor so that they can, when you're ticking off, all of your symptoms, they can kind of connect them into one thing and order the right test for you to have.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm also talking to myself because I need a primary care doctor because my last one didn't
pass the test.
She did not pass my test. So I wanted to talk a little bit about heart, but what else should we be focused on? We talked about heart, we talked about diabetes, perimenopause,
colon cancer screening.
Okay.
Colon cancer screening, extremely important.
Now, what age? Is it 50 still or no?
No, it is 45.
Is it?
Yeah. Yes, I know. I just
turned 45. I just turned 45 yesterday.
Yeah, this is
it?
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I need to go get a colonoscopy.
Yes, I just had my first one. It is not a bad experience.
I'm like in shock because I just knew it was 50. Yeah. What?
This is so if you think about it, like the way that you think of your mammograms, like this is the preventive step that you take in order to detect breast cancer. And but even more effective, but colonoscopies are even more effective because if there is a polyp found that is precancerous, the gastroenterologist can remove it right there in the procedure.
So now that I know how to do this, I need to find a primary care doctor to do that? Like
it depends on your insurance, but you should have a primary care doctor because somebody should, besides the gastroenterologist, should know the results.
Right. Somebody who cares. Wow. Okay. So a colonoscopy at 45. Yeah. So all my friends out there whose birthdays are this month, this year.
Please start. it's so just like for heart disease, when we look at who is dying of colon cancer, who's diagnosed at the advanced stages, it's African Americans.
We hear that a lot. It's always us. Why, Dr. Farmer? Why do we always die first?
Racism kills. Like, I can't put it any other way. Like,
racism kills. It does. It's sad.
racism kills. It
explain that.
So I've had people tell me that they sought me out as a Black PCP because they were tired of avoiding going to the doctor's office to avoid the discriminatory like actions of non-Black doctors, like of doctors that dismissed them, of doctors that just said, I had one student tell me that she was suffering from really severe constipation and irritable bowel syndrome. And a clinician told her that that's just what happens to Black people.
What?
Yeah.
Oh God, racism. It's in everything. It permeates every part of every system in this country, which is so sad. And go ahead.
No, I mean, so like when I see like the mortality, like, rates are increased for African Americans, like sometimes I'll have colleagues say, oh, it may be genetic. No, this is not genetic. This is societal. Like, this is not genetic. Black people come from multiple ancestries and ethnicities. We don't have one shared gene pool. We have a collective experience of discrimination.
Oof.
That is responsible.
I know you want to do research, but I need you to go back. I need you to go back and be my primary care doctor, please, on the side. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we have colonoscopies, mammograms.
I will text you the names of some women primary
please
care.
Do. I'm a good patient. I am. Just send me a letter and tell me I need to come back. So when it comes to, you mentioned very briefly a blood panel, a blood test. Is that something that we should get regularly and with our doctors, and how often, if so?
Yeah, so 40 and over, we should be evaluated for cardiovascular risk factors. So that's your blood lipid, your like cholesterol panel should be evaluated in your blood panel. We should also be looking at kidney function. And we should also be monitoring blood glucose, which is a sign, or hemoglobin A1C, both of which tell us about prediabetes or diabetes being present or your risk for it. And I say 40 because like this is the decade where, all of that accumulated lifetime exposure starts to catch up with us.
Right.
But then also based upon those lab results and your medical history, your doctor can actually calculate your we call it ASCVD, or your atherosclerosis risk, over the next 10 years, and can tell you what your risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years if you continue like these health habits, if you continue with these blood results. I found that very effective to talk to people about and to show them.
God. Do you see the fear in my eyes? You see the fear? I'm like, shit, okay.
But that's how we can use those results to actually like educate people about like, this is where you are, like, and like, let's work together.
Let's work together.
Yeah.
So I don't hear a lot of
in a good place, by the way.
Yeah. I guess I'll find out when I go get my colonoscopy. So we don't hear a lot about cholesterol. You mentioned cholesterol. I feel like I never hear about cholesterol anymore. Is that not really? You hear about high blood pressure a lot. Cholesterol, not so much, because it was tied to like, don't eat eggs, but then eggs was okay, and then cholesterol went away. I don't know.
We know much more now that our blood cholesterol is not like 1-to-1 determined by us eating eggs. So there's a lot of other factors, like the health of our liver is important. Our metabolic health is important for determining our cholesterol factors. Some of the research that I do looks at inflammation and your risk of having high cholesterol. So there's more than just the eating of the eggs. We're shifting out of that mind frame, but it's still an important indicator.
Okay. One other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is cancer, because most of the things that you mentioned for screening, and when you think about breast and you think about why you go get your pap smear every year or every 2 years, whatever it is now, why you get a colonoscopy is because of cancer. And cancer, I feel like it is a beast. Like, why haven't we cracked the code for why can't we figure out cancer? Why? I mean, I know you don't know.
I don't know
I'm
if
just
I
like,
know.
it does, and it doesn't even matter, your race or ethnicity, or if you're a man or a woman. Cancer don't care. It will show up. And why don't we know more about how we can, or do we know more about how we can avoid cancer and
Yeah.
in any part of our body? But
So yeah, I think we know more in the last decade. And to loop back to like the start of our conversation around why Black people need to be in more clinical trials, when you look at the advances in cancer the last decade, it's been in immunotherapy.
yes.
And what immunotherapy? So that's when we actually kind of leverage the immune system to actually fight the cancer cells. And we give like either a stimulant to the immune system, or we give some type of like antibodies to the immune system to stimulate that fight. But the immunotherapy trials were critical in like turning the tide in lung cancer, in
Right.
kidney cancer. And so there were not enough of us in those trials
Right.
to actually have like a real benefit, not to mention the fact that there's an access issue too.
Right. There
With
is.
with actually being referred to academic centers, as you know, that actually do that treatment and that therapy.
Right. And because the way that people get access to clinical trials is through their doctor. And it depends on what doctor if you're seeing a doctor in the community that is not associated with an academic medical center. And we define an academic medical center as a hospital that is tied to a medical school, and where the doctors and where doctors and the medical school work very closely, not only for like medical care, but for research, for clinical trials. It's a very close-knit relationship between the hospital and the school. And if your community hospital isn't associated with an academic medical center, the chances of you getting referred to a clinical trial is less. I mean, you can't,
Exactly.
it's a generalization, but it's your chances are less.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say about clinical trials is, I think when it comes to cancer, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm making a generalization because I work in the field. I feel like people know to ask for a clinical trial. Or do you feel like that? Like, I feel like clinical trials and cancer are kind of like, because there's always new research going on. There's always, you ask about clinical trials for cancer, not so much other things, but cancer for sure.
Yeah,
Is
I
one that
I will give you that. Yeah, people do know to like ask for it.
Yeah, to ask. And if you're not asking for it, and I also think because cancer is so serious, and people understand and have seen the effects of what cancer can do to the body and to loved ones, they're like, okay, a clinical trial is something that I would try to, that I would want to participate in, just to make sure that I can extend my life for as long as possible, even if it's for a year or 2 or 5, whatever it is, I'll take it, kind of thing. Interesting. I hate cancer. The last thing I want to talk to you about, because of your interest in nutrition, and I'm like looking at my list because I'm like, did we even get on my questions? Is sugar. And so when I talked to the nutritionist last week, we didn't talk a lot about sugar, but I do want to talk about why it used to be that fat was the thing we needed to avoid. And then it was like eggs. We talked about eggs in relation to cholesterol.
Right.
I think sugar and processed foods kind of rise to the top as the like public enemy number 1 and 2 when it comes to food. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So ultra processed foods. I think the most recent data show that in America, it makes up like 57 to 60% of most Americans' daily calories. So
What is an
most,
ultra
oh
processed
yeah, so
food?
no problem. Thank you for asking me. So ultra processed food is the worst processed food. So it's the one that has all the additives, and if someone from 100 years ago looked at it, they wouldn't identify it as food. It does not have any
Wow.
whole food component to it.
Can you give me an example? Like
Oh,
a Pop-Tart, is that real
oh
food?
yeah, that would count.
That's
Pop
not real
Tart,
food.
Dorito, like those
Not
foods.
Doritos.
I
I
no one
feel
ever
like
wants to hear the crunch snacks.
I feel like Doritos is flour. I feel like there's something in there in Doritos that makes it real food, but it's not. I
That
heard,
was the intention of Doritos, but then it just like
but okay, if ultra processed foods is it's like 60% of our diet, why and they're so bad for us. Why do we continue to allow companies to make it in that way? I mean, I guess you have that question as well as a
I do.
researcher.
Yeah, I have those same questions because I mean, like you mentioned fat, but fat, salt, and sugar are like our brains are, are programmed to want those in our diet.
Mhm.
And so food companies are leveraging that hardwiring to get us to be repeat customers.
Mm.
And then you add in that other ingredient of convenience in a time scarce society where everyone is on the move and doing this and doing that. Yeah, I don't know why they there's not more
I know
control or
why.
regulation over that.
Capitalism kills, racism kills,
Yeah,
capitalism kills.
yeah. and and they're tied.
they are,
Like,
they
and
are
they
tied.
and they're
So
tied
ultra
together.
processed foods and then sugar itself. And so I think people, when I think about, what I know about food and diet, I think I've lumped all sugars as like bad sugars, even sugar in fruit, pineapple, like we have ranked the
Mhm.
sugars to be bad. And the nutritionist last week was like, no,
Mm-mm.
that's not the case.
No.
Not all sugars are bad, but it's hard to retrain your brain to, because if the last I had a pineapple, like I bought a whole pineapple from the grocery store, and that was so good and it was so sweet. I felt bad for eating it, and I'm like,
Mhm.
why do I feel bad for eating a piece of fruit? Because it got
Mhm.
sugar, because it has sugar in it. And I'm like, I think that we just have this. How do we improve our relationship with food? I know you work, you mentioned your experience in working with people to help them learn how to cook, which is amazing, by the way. That's why I said you're an amazing primary care doctor, because I don't know any other I know a lot of primary care doctors, and I don't know any of them setting up, cooking demonstrations for their patients. And this is a small sample. It is not indicative of all primary care, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, so how do we have a better relationship with sugar and with food in general? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it is establishing that you have to have a relationship, like that you have to, this is going to be an ongoing ingredient, or food is going to be an ongoing component of
Right.
your life. How you choose to deal with it is a daily occurrence, right? And so honestly, there are some days that you need a few more pieces of pineapple, or you need a little bit of ice cream to like get through. I mean, this is like our brains are hardwired
Mm-hmm.
for sugar. It's the dopamine response that we
Right.
get from it. But we have to then also recognize on the days that we don't need that dopamine response, like how are we going to like not overutilize or abuse that relationship? It's like, sugar, I don't need you right now. Like, so
Right.
it has to be an ebb and flow
Mm-hmm.
to it. And that's one of the things that I think is important about being a part of your meal preparation process and cooking and being close to the ingredients, is that it gives you that connection to food and that time when you are preparing to think about like, do I really need you? Do I not need you? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think your example about looking at the food and asking if a caveman could identify, or a person from, 1856, could they identify what you're eating? And if they can't, then it's probably not something that you should be eating. But it's interesting because you think about, the world and how we have to feed all these people on the planet. And you think about plant-based meats that are
Mhm.
now being is that considered, that's not considered ultra processed, or is it?
It is. So it depends. I'm not going to say any companies, but
Okay.
there are some companies that by the standard, by the definition of ultra processed food, that they are considered that.
So the plant-based meats, I won't name any because I'm drawing a blank, but they're considered ultra processed.
Some of them
I know
are,
people
yeah,
think that they're healthier because they don't
contain
contain
meat,
animal
right? But
product.
you
Yeah.
still have to look at the ingredients. So you still have to look and you still have to see, is it mostly additives that are making up this meat product? For people that are allergic to soy or have a soy sensitivity, most
Hmm.
of those contain soy. Like, so you still have to like be
Yeah.
an advocate for yourself and be an aware consumer.
Is a good rule of thumb when you're looking at the ingredients. If you can't pronounce it or say it, then it's probably not something you should eat. Is that a good rule? Or I heard that if it has like more than 5 ingredients in it, then
Yeah,
maybe, that's good, but
I think
anything,
the
or that's bad.
more than 5 is a good, like, a good one. And I'll say I don't always stick to the rule of if I can't pronounce it, because sometimes it is a product that actually is using the correct
Mm,
botanical name. And so like,
okay.
you could be missing out on something good. So like, yeah,
Okay.
but even those products tend to just be 5, no more than 6, like,
Okay.
ingredients.
5
Yeah.
or 6 ingredients. Yeah. This is hard. I mean, this is why you have health disparities, because it's hard. It's hard if you live in a place that doesn't have grocery stores that are close, or where you can walk to, or they call them food deserts. It's harder
Exactly.
to do that when you have to go grocery shopping at the dollar store, and all of that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you are grocery shopping at the dollar store or at a corner store, there is a food tax in that. So like it's more expensive for those retailers to get that food. So like we think of the dollar store, even the dollar store is $1.25 now.
Right.
But the unit price is $1.25. Whereas if you go to a grocery store, the unit price might be 89 cents. Like,
Mhm.
and so it actually is not overall cheaper. Um,
Right. Right. So we talked about a lot of different things. You gave me a lot to consider, particularly in the screenings that we need to have. What tips do you have for women as we are entering, as we are, in middle age? How do we make it that our priority is our health is a priority? What tips do you have for us so that we can kind of strive to have, better health as we get older?
Whenever you can, use your voice, be your own advocate first, and be the advocate for your family. Also, use that same voice for your family. And then I think also it is just very important to not set things aside. So, intuition is important. Intuition
Hmm.
is God's voice or our own voice to telling ourselves to pay attention. Don't ignore, like, actually take the time to listen to it and act on it.
Hmm. Those are very actionable things, and I think things that people need to trust and take with them, kind of wherever they go, and into the hospital, into work, into all places. They're definitely beneficial. So thank you, Dr. Farmer. This has been a great
This
conversation, and
has
I'm trying to
been.
be respectful of your time, and not take up all of your time. But thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge and all of your experience.
Thank you
I
so much for
appreciate it.
having me. I appreciate
Sure.
it.
Absolutely. And for everybody else, I will see you next time.